reading press clips last night, this morning, and obviously a great deal of tension in the Persian Gulf. It seems like there always is, but now even more so. Yesterday, at least 3 armed Iranian boats reportedly tried to seize a British oil tanker in the Persian Gulf. They were unsuccessful. The tanker was crossing into the Strait of Hormuz when the Iranians ordered the ship to change course. That's oil, but natural gas would also be out in these same areas, and yet the word Hormuz, the Straits of Hormuz, do not appear in the latest IEA gas security review, which is just like, how can you not? How can you not include that as part of a security, a natural gas security review? So I guess the question, I'll go to both ends of the table here, to Mr. Safos and Mr. Winberg. You know, why not? Why are we not discussing this? I'm assuming that DOE has examined the potential impacts of a Hormuz incident on LNG flows and what that might mean to us. So if we can have a discussion here. They haven't called this second vote yet, so it just started, but that means I got a little bit of time. And I'm just, this is the geopolitical reality. And I mentioned earlier when I was asking about the Alaska situation, you know, one of the benefits that we have is we don't have to go through the Panama Canal. We don't have the choke points. We don't have the pirates. We are not the Strait of Hormuz. But that factors into the discussion about availability of supply. Right now, we know what we know geopolitically, but next week, it could all go to hell in a handbasket. So how do we factor this in as we're talking about LNG and the future of LNG exports from this country and more globally? Mr. Safos, if you want to go first, and then Secretary Winberg.
Thank you, Senator. I think what you highlight is incredibly important. And the way I think about it is, in this country in particular, oil security, at least since 1973, people have been talking about it, thinking about it, writing about it, convening. And we just have not had the same exposure and experience with gas internationally and with LNG. So I think it's a matter of just the market advancing a little bit faster than our institutions. The report that you referenced from the International Energy Agency, you know, to be fair to them, it's a review of gas security, of what has happened.
In the past tense.
But I think one of the examples that I wrote in my testimony is the European Union does stress tests. So we may have possibly on January 1st a disruption of gas flows through Ukraine. And we have an idea of what that would do to different markets, because there's an organization that runs stress tests and try to understand how different countries could cope with these kind of disruptions. So I think there's a role to play both on the United States side, but also multilaterally with the International Energy Agency to develop more tools, more information, to try to understand, for instance, if you did have a disruption in the Straits of Hormuz, who would be most exposed, what is the capacity of the system to respond, how would it respond, what kind of policy mechanisms might be required to make the response better. These conversations are just far, far behind, and I think it's time to elevate those, and I think that's one area where U.S. leadership with other countries of the IA can play a very important role.
Appreciate that. Yeah. Secretary?
Clearly, the Straits of Hormuz are a very significant issue. It's primarily an oil issue more than it is a natural gas issue. But I think it's also worthy of note that despite these attacks, well, if we had had these attacks 10 years ago, I think you would have seen a massive spike in the price of oil. And we're not seeing that so much, and that's because we have more distributed production coming out of the United States. With respect specifically to U.S. LNG, I said earlier we're moving a lot of that into the European market, so the straits are not an impediment. There's talk about the constraints in the Panama Canal. Those are congestion constraints, not geopolitical constraints. But we have a wider variety of outlets and routes that we can move the LNG, whether it's through the Panama Canal or whether it's through this around the Cape of Good Hope or straight over to Europe. So it's not so much affecting LNG. Again, that's not to say it's not critical and it's not important, but it is more of an oil issue than it is a natural gas issue at this point.
At this point. And I
Right.
think that that's important to recognize, and I appreciate what you said, Mr. Safos, about the IEA report being kind of a look back instead of projecting forward. But I think that this is something that we need to be thinking about, not just for the perspective of how do we move our gas, but how do others move their gas to supply those markets, whether it's China, Qatar to China or wherever. And if that is disruptive, what that then does to the broader mix. Mr. Ariola?
Yes, Senator, what I would tell you is we're dealing with very sophisticated customers out there that they don't just look at price. Price is obviously a very important driver, but they're looking at availability, the reliability of where it's coming from, the operator, the financial strength, congestion points. In the LNG market today, unlike the oil market, I think at the end of 2018, we had less than 600 tankers out there. In the oil market, there are thousands of different sizes. So that's why you have more liquidity in the market as well. But I think that what we're finding is customers, especially in Asia and in Europe, are becoming much more sophisticated and concerned from a risk management standpoint of all of those factors. So we think that security of the supply is extremely important.
So I mentioned that the IEA is a look back. I'm going to ask you to do a little gazing into the crystal ball here, because we've heard some say that global LNG infrastructure could actually become stranded assets as we see the mix of the energy mix change in the years going forward. Is this a concern that you all think about? When you're talking about a regasification facility, export facilities, these are substantial investments, and here we've got a case in point here in this country where about 10 years or so ago we were talking about we need to build more import LNG terminals. We've turned that around and gone the other way with exports. So we know how things can change. Is that something that you're worried about right now, or it's just too far out on the horizon, or are you just thinking about other things? Dr. Hart?
If I could comment from a China angle, China is planning for renewable non-fossil energy to account for 20% of their energy mix by 2030 and over 50% of their energy mix by 2050. So we should definitely take that long-term goal into account before getting too excited about what role LNG could play in their energy mix.
Mr. Ariel?
Yeah, and I would tell you, as a developer of export terminals, we look at diversity of supplier or diversity of customers very importantly. At our Cameron LNG facility, for example, we've got 3 major customers that each take a third, and they're diversified geographically and the customers that they serve because we want diversity. And as we think about what we're doing in the other facilities in Louisiana, Texas, or from the Mexico, we want to make sure that we have multiple potential customers and maybe even potential equity investors so that you can reduce that risk of somebody walking away and you have an empty plant.
Mr. Savas? Go ahead, either one of you. Go ahead.
Senator, I worry about this a little bit, in part because I've done a lot of forecasts in my life, so I know how wrong they tend to be. Having said that, I think there's 2 reasons why other people don't worry as much as I do. One is, if you look at most long-term scenarios, even in a transition of the energy system towards sort of a Paris plus or minus world, gas does well. That's sort of the base. The second thing that I think is even less understood is the system is sort of shifting from relying on power generation as a source of growth to relying on industry and buildings. So power generation is the area where gas has a lot of competition with renewables. The competition in the buildings and in the industrial sector is less severe. So I think there are a lot of people that are comforted by the fact that they're not just relying on power generation that is very competitive for gas demand growth, but they have a broader sort of customer base, and that therefore, even in a transition of the energy system, those areas of consumption will remain. So I think those are the things that people respond to me to make me worry less. But I still worry about, whenever you make 25-year bets, some people are bound to be wrong.
Mr. Rydell?
Yeah, so the only thing that I would add there, I think that those are fantastic points. The one thing that I would think is important to also talk about, and Dr. Hart actually touched on it earlier, is the development of technology on the import side, especially as Senator Cassidy was making suggestions about the Ex-Im Bank and their involvement. The ability to invest in an asset that will no longer be an onshore asset, no longer stranded, so to speak, and especially in emerging markets, where maybe creditworthiness might be a challenge for those countries that are looking to transition to natural gas. Having that ability to move a regasification that's floating rather than an onshore facility gives that sort of optionality that if we run into some sort of change, whether it be from a financial standpoint or technology standpoint that allows a different adoption of a different fuel, now all of a sudden we have the ability to move that asset to someplace else. So I would suggest that as technology on the import side continues to develop, it reduces that risk that you were asking about.
All very important points. I appreciate that. This has been a great conversation. You know, I'm just thinking, some years back, I tasked my energy team to help us put some focus on what we called our Energy 2020. It sounded so far away. And now we're working on 2030, but at that time, you know, it was really kind of a vision that we might be able to get to a point where, from an LNG perspective, we were actually a player. And we have gone from just dreaming about being a player to being the player in many ways. And so it is a reminder to us that the technologies have allowed us to do so much, but it's also a reminder, and you mentioned this, Dr. Hart, to not assume that the markets that we're banking on today are still going to be those great customers for us 10 years from now, because they may do just exactly what we did in this past decade in terms of our ability to ramp up. And so I think we recognize that there is a fair amount of, this is a dynamic environment. I don't recall which one of you used the terminology. It's an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary. But sometimes that evolution happens quicker than any of us could have imagined or dreamed. So staying on top of things is critically important to us, but also recognizing the role that we can play from a geopolitical perspective, our strategic role. And again, that's why we have rolled out this first of a series of white papers in terms of our global strategic energy competition. Because we are at that place where we really can be engaged in that global competition, and how we assert that leadership is going to be an important part of the mix moving forward. So thank you for the conversation. Very, very helpful to what we have been talking about here as members of this committee. But I think you've challenged us to think a little more broadly about what the opportunities, but also to be cautious about some of the hurdles or the pitfalls that may lie ahead. Dr. Hart, you raise a fair and legitimate concern about when somebody's willing to pay a premium price, they're usually looking for something in return. I think that you certainly heard from Senator Manchin an air of caution there. Alaskans are clearly eyes wide open. As they have looked to how they can move their natural gas. We certainly don't want the Chinese to have control, and that was made very, very clear. But again, you go into these agreements making no assumptions that it's going to be an easy road when you've got partners that may have some different interests than you. So I'm told that we're closing out the vote, so I'm going to go do my duty there, but I thank you for joining us with the committee here today.